Vienna, November 9th, 1938. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the streets like artillery fire. Synagogues burned. Stormtroopers dragged families into the streets. The night would later be called Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. But for 7-year-old Rachel Weinberg, it was simply the night the monsters became real. She pressed against her mother in their apartment as boots thundered up the stairs. Her father stood at the door, his pharmacist's hands trembling, knowing that education and respectability meant nothing anymore. Below them, their neighbors' screams cut through the night. The smell of smoke drifted through the windows. This wasn't war yet. This was something worse, the promise of what war would bring. By morning, 30,000 Jewish men had been arrested. 91 were dead. And every parent in Vienna understood with terrible clarity. Their children had no future here. Not in schools, not in parks, not breathing. The impossible math began immediately. Britain had made an offer. They would take Jewish children, unaccompanied children. The word unaccompanied did the work of a bullet. It meant, we'll save your children, but not you. Choose. Rachel's mother, Sarah, sat at the kitchen table with the application forms. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the pen. Name, age, medical history. As if these bureaucratic words could contain the enormity of what she was about to do. Across Vienna, across Berlin, across Prague, 10,000 mothers filled out the same forms, each line of ink a small death. The waiting list grew longer. Parents bribed, begged, called in every favor. Some families had 3 children but could only afford to send one. Which one? The oldest, who might survive alone. The youngest, who deserved more years. The sickest, who needed safety most. The healthiest, who had the best chance. There were no right answers, only impossible choices. Sarah Weinberg chose Rachel because she was 7, old enough to remember them, young enough to adapt. Her older brother stayed behind. Years later, Rachel would learn he died at Mauthausen. She would spend her life wondering if she took his spot on the train. The train station in Vienna, December 10th, 1938. 600 children gathered with cardboard signs around their necks bearing their names and destination addresses. Parents dressed them in their finest clothes. Wool coats with jewelry sewn into the linings, patent leather shoes, hair braided so tightly it pulled at scalps. Sarah braided Rachel's hair 3 times before she got it right. Her fingers kept slipping. She was trying to make it perfect because perfect children get loved by strangers, and loved children survive, and survival was all she had left to give her daughter. Rachel's father, David, knelt until their eyes were level. He pressed a photograph into her palm, the 3 of them from the previous summer when the world still made sense. On the back, in his careful handwriting, "We will find you, we promise. Wait for us." The train whistle screamed. Sarah grabbed Rachel so hard it hurt. The smell of rosewater and bread dough and home. Rachel tried to memorize it, not knowing she would spend 70 years searching for that scent in every embrace and never finding it again. "Be good," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking apart. "Be so good they'll love you." Then came the moment that would define everything after. The conductor called for children to board. Parents pressed forward, hands reaching, voices calling last instructions, last endearments, last words that might have to last forever. Rachel looked back once. Her mother was running alongside the train, one hand pressed against the window, her face destroyed. Her father stood frozen on the platform, his mouth moving in words Rachel couldn't hear. The train picked up speed. Her mother fell behind. The station disappeared. 600 children hurtled toward the border, away from everything they knew, toward people they'd never met who might or might not want them. If you're feeling the weight of this story, hit that like button and subscribe. These children's stories deserve to be remembered, and stick with us, because what happens next will restore your faith in humanity. The journey took 3 days. At the border, Nazi guards boarded the train one last time. They walked through the cars, looking at the children with expressions that made Rachel shrink into her seat. One guard stopped at a boy clutching a teddy bear. He ripped it apart, looking for hidden valuables. Stuffing floated through the air like snow. Then they crossed into Holland, and something shifted. Dutch volunteers boarded with food, real food, bread and cheese and milk. They spoke gently. Some of them were crying as they handed out sandwiches to children too traumatized to eat. The boats to England were rough. Children vomited over the rails, clutching their small suitcases. Their cardboard signs soggy with sea spray. Some were as young as 3 years old, traveling alone, not fully understanding that going to England meant never seeing Mama again. Liverpool Street Station, London. British volunteers had set up tables with hot chocolate and biscuits. They held up signs matching the destinations on the children's tags. It was an auction of mercy, families choosing children based on age, appearance, manageability. Some children were selected immediately. Others stood for hours, watching trains pull away without them, wondering what was wrong with them that no one wanted them. Rachel waited 4 hours before her name was called. Margaret Fletcher had never met a Jewish person before. She lived in a brick house in the Cotswolds with her husband Thomas and their 2 children, Jean and Robert. Thomas had told her she was mad to take in a refugee child, but he'd said it gently, and he'd helped her prepare the small bedroom anyway. What came up the lane that December afternoon was a child so small, so thin, with a crooked braid and eyes that had already seen the end of the world. A social worker held her hand. Rachel carried a single battered suitcase nearly as big as herself. Margaret opened the door, and Rachel looked up at her with an expression that would haunt Margaret for 50 years. Hope and terror mixed so completely, they became the same thing. "Hello, love," Margaret said, though she knew the child couldn't understand English. She held out her hand. Rachel didn't take it. Instead, she set down her suitcase very carefully, smoothed her coat, and curtsied like she was meeting royalty. Then she pulled out the photograph and held it up, showing Margaret the people she'd left behind. "Mama," Rachel said. "Papa." Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest. She knelt down on the gravel path, not caring about her good dress, and took the photograph gently, reverently, as if it were made of light. "Yes," Margaret said. "Mama and Papa, they love you so much." Rachel's face crumpled, but she didn't cry. She pressed her lips together hard, forcing the tears back. She was being good, being so good they would love her. Margaret made a decision in that moment that would change 2 lives. She opened her arms, not commanding, not expecting, just offering. And Rachel fell into them like someone who'd been drowning, finally reaching shore. "You don't have to be good," Margaret whispered into that crooked braid. "You can be sad. You can be angry. You can cry as much as you need. You're safe here." And finally, permission granted. Rachel wept. She wept for Vienna, and for her mother's hands, and for her father's last words, and for her brother who stayed behind. She wept until Margaret's shoulder was soaked and her own throat was raw, and she had no more tears left. Margaret held on. She held on through the heaving sobs, through the gasping breaths, through the moment Rachel whispered, "Mama," in a voice so broken it barely qualified as sound. She held on because it was the only thing she knew how to do. That night, Thomas Fletcher stood in the doorway of Rachel's room, listening to her cry in her sleep. He was a practical man, a banker who dealt in numbers and certainty, but watching his wife sit beside a stranger's child, stroking her hair and humming softly, he understood they'd made a covenant. This child was theirs now, not replacing anything, not fixing anything, just theirs. The weeks that followed were impossibly hard. Rachel spoke no English. The food was strange. No kosher kitchen in the Fletcher house. No familiar tastes. Margaret tried to make things she thought a child would like, but Rachel ate mechanically, dutifully, like it was a test she had to pass. At school, children mocked her accent before she lost it. They called her refugee like it was a disease. John Fletcher, who was 9, sometimes defended her and sometimes resented the attention this strange girl took from their mother. Robert, who was 12, mostly ignored her, which was perhaps the kindest option. Rachel tried so hard. She memorized English phrases. She learned to curtsy when adults entered rooms. She made her bed with hospital corners. She never complained. She was being good, always good, because good children don't get sent away twice. Before we continue with what happens next, take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell. The next part of this story will break your heart in the best possible way. And drop a comment telling us, would you have opened your door? Understanding the weight of these decisions matters. The letters from Vienna came like clockwork at first. Once a week, David Weinberg's careful handwriting arrived, full of coded reassurances. We are well. Uncle Georg sends his love, meaning Uncle Georg had been arrested. The weather is cold, meaning food was scarce. We miss you terribly, meaning exactly what it said, with no code necessary. Rachel read each letter 100 times. She kept them in a box under her bed, arranged chronologically, evidence that her parents still existed somewhere in the world. Margaret helped her write replies. Rachel's English was improving, but she wrote in German, pouring out details of her new life while carefully not mentioning how much she was learning to love the people who weren't her parents. The guilt of happiness felt like betrayal. Sarah Weinberg wrote on the margins of David's letters, recipes for Rachel's favorite foods, reminders to brush her teeth, questions about whether she'd grown, promises that they were making plans to come to England too. The plans were lies. Even the Weinbergs knew they were lies, but lies that kept hope alive seemed forgivable. Then the letters came less frequently, once every 2 weeks, once a month. The handwriting got shakier, the paper got thinner, the coded messages got more desperate. September 1939. War broke out. The mail from occupied territories became impossible. Rachel's 10th birthday arrived in April 1940. Margaret baked a cake, chocolate, because she'd learned it was Rachel's favorite. The whole family gathered around the kitchen table. They sang "Happy Birthday" in English, but Rachel closed her eyes and heard it in German, her father's deep voice and her mother's soprano harmony. She blew out the candles. 10 small flames extinguished with one breath. She wished for the same thing she wished for every night, every birthday, every falling star, that her parents would come through the door, smiling, saying it had all been a terrible mistake. That night, Margaret sat on the edge of Rachel's bed. In her hands was a letter, not from Vienna, but from the British Red Cross. She'd received it 3 days earlier and had spent 72 hours trying to find the courage to begin. "Darling," Margaret said, and her voice was already breaking, "I need to tell you something about your mama and papa." Rachel knew before Margaret said the words. She'd known, somehow, for months, the way you know the seasons are changing before the first leaf falls. But knowing and hearing are different countries, and the journey between them is made of broken glass. "Treblinka," Margaret said. The word meant nothing to Rachel then. Later, it would mean everything. Later, she would learn it was a death camp in occupied Poland. Later, she would learn that 6,000 people could be murdered there in a single day. Later, she would learn that her parents had survived Vienna and deportation and ghettos and transport trains only to die in gas chambers disguised as showers. But in that moment, she only understood the finality in Margaret's voice. "They're gone?" Rachel asked, her voice small. "Yes, love, I'm so sorry." Rachel didn't cry. She was still being good. Instead, she said something that would echo in Margaret's heart for decades. If I'd stayed, I would have died with them, but I would have been with them. Margaret had no answer for that. There was no answer for that. The mathematics of survival and love produced only impossible equations. So she did the only thing she could. She pulled Rachel close and held on while the girl finally stopped being good. Rachel screamed. She screamed for her mother's braided hair and her father's round spectacles and her brother whose name she was already starting to forget. She screamed for the unfairness of living when they died. She screamed for the guilt of being grateful she'd been sent away. She screamed until her voice gave out. Margaret held on through all of it. Thomas stood in the doorway, his practical banker's face wet with tears. Jung climbed onto the bed and took Rachel's hand. Even Robert came in, awkward and 13, and sat on the floor against the bed frame, bearing witness to grief that had no bottom. This is the moment we want you to pause and reflect. If this story is touching something in you, leave a comment about what acts of kindness changed your life or your family's life. These stories of humanity matter more now than ever. And please, share this video. Let's remind the world what ordinary people are capable of. The war continued for 5 more years. By the time it ended in 1945, 6 million Jews had been murdered in the Holocaust. Of the nearly 10,000 children saved by the Kindertransport, most never saw their parents again. Some children, a handful, were reunited with surviving relatives. An aunt who'd hidden in a basement, an uncle who'd escaped to Switzerland. But they were strangers to each other now. The children spoke English with British accents. They ate bacon. They celebrated Christmas. The relatives who'd known them as small children found teenagers who'd been transformed by survival. For most, like Rachel, there were no reunions, only confirmation of what they'd already known in their bones. The question became, where is home? Rachel had spent 6 years in England. She was 13 years old. She barely remembered Vienna. Her English was perfect, unaccented. Her German was fading. She belonged nowhere completely and everywhere partially. Some Kindertransport children left England after the war, searching for roots in Palestine or America or anywhere that might feel less haunted. Others stayed. They were formally adopted by the families who'd taken them in. They became British citizens. They built lives on top of graves. Rachel stayed. Margaret and Thomas formally adopted her when she was 14. She kept her birth name, Rachel Weinberg Fletcher, carrying both worlds in her hyphenated identity. She grew up. She attended university, studying medicine like her father had wanted. She married a kind man named David. Yes, David. The same name as her father, who never minded that she sometimes called out in German in her sleep. She had 3 children and told them stories about 2 sets of grandparents, the ones who'd braided her hair and sent her away, and the ones who'd opened their door and chosen love. Both things are true, she would tell them. I lost everything, and I was saved by love. Neither negates the other. Both are real. Her children had children. Those children had children. Today, Rachel Weinberg Fletcher's family tree includes 47 descendants, doctors, teachers, artists, accountants, parents, all living because a woman named Margaret Fletcher knelt on gravel in her good dress and opened her arms to a terrified child. Multiply that by 10,000 and you begin to understand the mathematics of mercy. The Kindertransport wasn't a perfect rescue. Some children were treated poorly by their foster families, used as servants, made to feel their survival was a debt that could never be repaid. Some were placed with families who tried to erase their Jewish identity entirely. Some were abused. Some were simply tolerated rather than loved. The story isn't simple, and it isn't clean, but thousands more were loved. Imperfectly, yes. How could it be perfect? But genuinely. They were folded into families who gave them what they could. Safety, childhood, education, a chance at life. Parents who weren't parents became parents. Children who weren't children became children. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. Here's what the Kindertransport teaches us. In humanity's darkest hour, when industrial murder was operating with bureaucratic efficiency, when evil had uniforms and train schedules and a systematic plan to erase an entire people from existence, ordinary people said no. Not governments, not armies, not politicians making grand speeches. Ordinary people. A housewife in the Cotswolds, a shopkeeper in Manchester, a teacher in Edinburgh, a farmer in Wales. People who could barely afford another mouth to feed but set another place at the table anyway. People who spoke no German but learned to say, "I love you," in a foreign tongue. People who had every reason to stay safe and comfortable but chose courage instead. They didn't stop the Holocaust. They couldn't. 6 million died. The evil was too vast, too mechanized, too thoroughly planned. But they stopped it from being total. They saved 10,000 futures. They proved that even when darkness has tanks and guns and gas chambers, light can still survive in the small spaces where one person opens a door to another. That's the lesson we carry forward from World War II. Not just the history of battles won and fascism defeated, but the quiet truth that evil only wins completely when ordinary people do nothing. And 10,000 times, ordinary people did something. They braided hair with shaking hands and let their children board trains to nowhere. They knelt on gravel and took in strangers' grief. They held on through nightmares and language barriers and the impossible task of parenting children who'd already lost everything. They chose love when hate was the easier path. Rachel Weinberg Fletcher died in 2018 at the age of 87. At her funeral, 47 descendants gathered, her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. They said Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead. They also sang Jerusalem, the British patriotic hymn, because Rachel had contained multitudes. On her gravestone, they inscribed words from both sets of parents. Be good, from Sarah Weinberg, and You don't have to be good, from Margaret Fletcher. Both were true. Both were love. Both shaped the woman she became. This is what we're fighting for when we fight for humanity. Not perfection, not easy answers, not stories without grief. We're fighting for the truth that love can coexist with loss, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that even when the world is burning, someone will still open a door. The Kindertransport wasn't the largest rescue operation of World War II. It wasn't the most celebrated. It doesn't have the dramatic flair of military victories or resistance movements, but it might be the most important story we tell because it's the most replicable. You don't need to be a soldier or a spy or a hero. You just need to be human enough to see another human in need and say, "Come in, you're safe here." That's the call to action from this story. Not to remember the past as something distant and finished, but to recognize the same choice presenting itself today. There are always children who need doors opened. There are always families who need help. There are always strangers who need to become neighbors. The question isn't whether the world needs saving. It's whether you'll be someone who answers the door when history knocks. 10,000 children were sent away so they could live. 10,000 impossible goodbyes, 10,000 families in Britain who opened their doors when the world was closing. The darkness was real. The evil was real. 6 million murdered. But so was this. Ordinary people refusing to let evil have the final word. Margaret Fletcher, kneeling on gravel in her good dress, taking a crooked braid in her hands and choosing love over fear. That image contains everything you need to know about how humanity wins. Not through grand gestures or perfect people, but through small acts of courage multiplied by thousands. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that ordinary people can change the world, do one thing: share it. Click that share button and send it to someone who needs to remember what humanity is capable of. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. We tell stories that matter, stories that remind us who we can be at our best.